afternoon. My name is Alex Padilla. I'm the director of the Exploring Economic Freedom Project. And this afternoon we are very lucky to have Stephen Miller, who is a professor at Western Carolina University. His research is mostly focused on education and economic belief. He's actually currently writing a book called Econophobia. So please welcome Steve.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks for having me. Thanks all of you for coming. So the title of this talk is provocative, right? Why education is overrated. If I wanted to be less provocative, I would have made the title Why estimates of the returns to education are probably overstated usually. But that's a lot more wordy and a lot less fun. But the idea is education gets credit for a lot of things in our society. Education gets credit for people having higher earnings in their lives, right? People who have higher levels of education have higher earnings. People who have higher levels of education are more likely to be civically engaged in society. They're less likely to commit crime. There's all kinds of things that higher levels of education are associated with that most of us in our normative judgments would say are good. So that's where I start off with. And I break it up, okay, into internal and external benefits of education. So what is education getting credit for? Primarily, there's two main categories, which are the internal benefits, which means the benefits to the people who get the education, right? If you get more education, there are benefits to you, presumably. Otherwise, you're paying a lot of money for nothing, right? And labor economists call that building human capital, all right? They call it human capital because education is like a capital good in that it's something that makes you more productive. That's the dominating model in economic thought and in labor economics, is to think of people getting education, and their model of it is kind of you go to school. For example, if you're going to college, you go to college, knowledge pours out of the professor's mouth and out of the professor's keyboard and into your head, and then you absorb it and you become more productive later in life. Now that's a simplified version of what we think education is, but that's a kind of a nice, quick, crude way of explaining it, okay? So what does then education mean? Well, it means you're going to have more productive workers in society and they're going to have higher earnings. But it's important to highlight that those are what economists call internal benefits. They're private benefits. You reap the rewards because who earns a higher salary? You do, right? But there are also external benefits, sometimes called positive externalities, okay? And typically, those are, what I'm going to discuss today are the literature on civic returns, all right, and the idea of people being more civically engaged, more likely to vote, you know, higher levels of civic behavior, as the researchers tend to say in that field, all right? But also I'm going to point out that another benefit, external benefit associated with higher levels of education is you tend to see less political extremism. So people tend to have more moderate beliefs. So I'm going to start with the internal benefits. This is the textbook. For whatever reason at my school, we all use the same textbook for micro and macroeconomics. We have to agree on one, and we all use the same one. And we use McConnell, Brew, and Flynn, which is, if not the best-selling economics textbook right now, it's the second best-selling. It's a hugely popular. I got this from the 17th edition. They're actually on the 19th edition. We don't adopt every new edition right away. So this graph shows down here a worker's age, all right, from 18 to 65-ish. And then this is salary in tens of thousands of dollars. So this is $20,000, this is $100,000, and so on. And this is a very good quick snapshot of what the average returns to higher levels of education are. So someone who just has a higher high school diploma, a high school education, what do you see? Well, they start working around between 18 and 24, hopefully closer to 18, right? You don't stay in mom's basement and play video games until you're 30. Hopefully you start working sooner. And you earn more and more, all right, as you age, but there's a pretty low ceiling on a high school graduate's earnings, all right? Now, these are averages. Some high school graduates do very well. Bill Gates, okay, right? And some high school graduates don't do quite as well. I mean, that's what that means if that's the average, all right? For people with an associate's degree, it's a significant bump, all right? During the middle years of your life, it's $5,000 to $10,000 a year in terms of higher salary for someone with an associate's degree. For a bachelor's degree, if you look at the difference between a high school diploma and bachelor's degree, that's $15,000 to $20,000 a year more in the middle of your working career. Now, why do you think this curves, right? Well, when you get a college degree, you start working later, and it takes time to build up to your maximum salary. And then most people, as they age, they either start retiring in their late 50s and early 60s, and then by the time they're 65, you know, more and more people are retiring. Professional degree, older versions of the textbook used to say graduate degree, but they decided to say, well, wait a minute, let's measure for a professional degree, and that made the numbers much higher. So what does professional degree mean? Well, it means MBA, it means an MD, you know, a doctor, it means people with law degrees, things like that. If they were to plot a line for PhDs, it would be below this, even though they go to school longer. Go figure. All right? Actually, I can explain exactly why. Because we're less productive than people with professional degrees, right? So those earnings are very, very high. Now, I'm going to criticize this a little bit, but I'm not going to criticize the overall conclusion, right? When you guys look at this, what's the obvious conclusion you draw?
Pros start later.
Huh?
Pros start later.
What?
More education, more money.
More education, more money. What personal conclusion do you draw? If you look at this and you see, here's how much you earn if you go to graduate school and get a graduate or professional degree. Here's how much you earn if you finish college and get a bachelor's degree. Here's what you earn if you have a couple of years in now and you can turn that into some sort of 2-year degree. And here's what you would have earned over your life if you had never come here at all. What is the basic message? More earnings? Yeah?
It just seems like a no-brainer to go to school.
It's a no-brainer to go to school, right?
Well, why wouldn't you go for
Right, exactly, right? If you believe yourself at all capable, right, of getting into a high-paying profession that requires a higher level professional degree, the conclusion seems to be stay in school. And not just stay in school until you get out of high school, but stay in school until you get out of college. And then once you're out of college, you still stay in school. So, and I show this exact graph to my micro-principal students when I talk about labor economics and the returns to education. And to be honest, I don't say any more than that. That's the story. That's what I want them to absorb because they're already in college, and I think they're going to be a lot better off if they graduate. And if they're at all inclined, I think they realize they're going to be a lot better off if they continue to pursue education before that. But those returns are not equal for everybody, okay? Not everybody realizes those really high returns, okay? And some people, this is a picture, I think it's from Zuccotti Park. It was part of the Occupy Wall Street crowd last year, all right? This is one of the protesters, and he's pointing out, unemployed superhero, master of degrees, shackled by debt, and he's got a ball and chain of student loans that he's chained to, okay? So the benefits of education we've talked about, but you have to weigh those against the costs. Degrees are expensive. They can be very, very expensive if you go to certain schools, okay? Medical school is extremely expensive. The typical doctor, I think, enters the workforce with about $500,000 in debt, or between $250,000 and $500,000 in debt, depending on where they went to medical school. You know, often people with law degrees have $100,000 in student loan debt or more. So you have to think very carefully, well, how much am I willing to invest to get this high return? And it matters, right? So it's not just about maximizing your return, it's about maximizing your return taking cost into account. So that's one thought. And these returns are unequal because it does depend what kind of program you go into. All right? One of these examples is someone with a master's degree. The other one is someone who has a bachelor's degree. So these, within the past year, were stories that got a lot of attention in the media. The first one was in the Washington Post, and it was about Molly Catchpole. And Molly Catchpole was an activist. She started a movement to get Bank of America to reduce their monthly fees for having a debit card. Bank of America decided to start charging all their customers a monthly fee of like $6, $8, whatever, just for you to have the darn debit card, which for most of you, I'm guessing, is how you get your money at all, right? That's like, to you, that's your access to your account. Otherwise, you would have to, like during those 3 hours a day that a bank is open, walk in there and write yourself a check, which is strange, right? That's what we used to do, but whatever. That used to be how everyone did it, right? And so she fought against that, and Bank of America ended up rescinding on that policy, and they now, they decided not to charge people for that service. Well, Molly Catchpole went to Roger Williams University in Rhode Island, which is a fairly expensive private liberal arts college in Rhode Island, and her major wasn't crazy. It was, it was a combined major of anthropology, but then also written communications. She's a good writer. She's good at networking with people, as she showed during her time as an activist last year. All right, but the article on the Washington Post didn't focus just on her activism. It also talked about her plight, where she is right now in the middle of a recession, and she's basically scraping along. She has a couple of part-time jobs that don't have any benefits with them, and she makes maybe on average $11 an hour, and she maybe only gets 30 hours a week of work. So that's not a lot of money, right, to pay back her $40,000 in student loan debt. Well, she and her mother disagree in the article how much student loan debt she has. She says 20, her mom says no, there's 20,000 in subsidized and 20,000 in unsubsidized. That's $40,000 in debt. My guess is her mom is right, but I shouldn't assume. But they do have differing accounts of how much she owes. All right? So it's hard for someone, even someone, and you can get a sense from the article, she's very smart, you know what I mean? But where she went to school happened to be very expensive, right? And maybe she didn't necessarily think, oh, I'm going to go into an area that's going to maximize my return. Okay, so she's living in Washington, D.C., which is a very expensive city to live in. Probably more expensive than Denver, I guess. Another example is Joe Theron, and he lives in New York City, which I don't know of a more expensive city than New York City except Paris. And he got a Master's of Fine Arts in Puppetry from the University of Connecticut. He was working as an arts teacher in a public high school in New York City. And he had a good, not a great salary, but he had a decent salary and benefits. All right? Well, he decided to pursue his dream and get a Master's of Fine Arts in his field, which was puppetry. All right? And he has $35,000 in student loan debt. The problem is, he came back, and New York City had hiring freezes in his field for teachers who were teaching art, and they had hired someone to replace him anyway. So all the principal of the school could do was hire him back part-time. So he's making far less than he did before he went and got his master's degree. And he's looked around and he struggled to make ends meet. Now that was in The Nation, where that report was. What I find interesting about these examples and examples like them, though, is that even in a pretty rough economy, right? Let's just say a very slow recovery out of a pretty prolonged recession, that these individuals are underemployed. They're not actually unemployed. There are many more people where the outcome is worse. They're unemployed. They're not just underemployed. They're actually unemployed. So the way I think about it, there are actually three explanations for why education would increase earnings. One is human capital, which is what I talked about. Knowledge makes workers more productive, and when workers are more productive, they tend to earn more. That's standard labor economics. Another reason, right? Human capital, I think, is part of the story, obviously, right? People who have high levels of education are able to do things that they wouldn't have been able to do without that education. But I think another important thing that education does is that it signals and selects for ability, and specifically cognitive ability, although there are other kinds of ability that education signals for, such as the ability to show up, right? The ability to take on new material and reproduce it and really conform and do what the professor tells you, right? Be prompt, all of that. But it definitely signals and selects for ability. When someone has a prestigious degree, you immediately think to yourself, that's probably a pretty smart person, okay? So what I'm saying is, it seems likely that more intelligent students tend to stay in school longer, right? People get medical degrees and law degrees and even PhDs, right? They tend, right? these tend to be people who are really good at school. So maybe it's not every kind of smart in the world, but certainly school smarts, right? Those are the people who consume or who pursue the most education. All right? And they tend to do that because they find it easier and more enjoyable than probably the average student does. And they also tend to perform better. All their lives, they've been getting high grades and doing well on standardized tests. And that's important because standardized tests are often what gets you into college and graduate programs and things like that, along with your GPA. A third thing to think about, and I don't discuss this a lot more tonight, but this is important to think about, is that education signals conscientiousness, and that's what I was talking about. The showing up, the soft skills, the ability to deal with people, the ability to work on a group project, the ability to give an oral presentation, the ability to write, to present your thoughts in writing. That conscientiousness and what an economist named James Heckman at the University of Chicago calls soft skills, that those are also important. All right. So because education probably signals ability pretty strongly, labor economists have a term that they use to talk about a reason why the returns education might be overstated, and that's ability bias. In econometric speak, it's an omitted variable bias. It's a specific form of omitted variable bias. And what you see is that, and I'm quoting Brian Kaplan here because he did it in the NLSY, you can do the same thing in the General Social Survey, which is the largest social science public opinion data set out there for the US, is that if you estimate the effect of schooling and you don't control for intelligence or some measure of IQ, all right, you're going to find that 1 year of school increases earnings on average by 12.6%. But if you control for IQ, the coefficient on education, that estimate of education's effect, drops to 7.5%. All right, that is a drop of, I'm not good at doing math in my head, but it's between 30 and 40% if I'm right. Right? That's a pretty darn significant drop. That education has returns, but a big part of those returns depend on who you are and how good you are at pursuing that education and whether you have what it takes to get into those programs. All right, so I've used the General Social Survey and I found a similar result to Brian. I came up with a number around between 30 and 40%, about 32%. So in other words, education probably does increase earnings, but not as much as you might think, and it probably doesn't work in quite the way that most of us think of, right? Education increases earnings, but it's probably overstated to say just take anyone and give them more education. It'll only increase earnings, but not that 12.6% increase in salary per extra year of education. The other thing is the mechanism might be different. It may be more about those soft skills. It may be more about conscientiousness. It may be more about learning to show up on time and do a complex task and report back on it. So it may be more about that than actually, right, the stuff you learn in all your classes you may not use out there in your jobs. So this begs an interesting question, I think, which is, does intelligence cause people to become more educated, as I'm asserting, or is it the other way around? Because that's a possibility, right? What we're hoping is that not just that people who have more higher levels of cognitive ability, people who are smarter, for lack of a better word, right? Not only would they tend to get more education, but you would hope that giving people education makes them smarter, right? That it can actually increase your intelligence. So I want to take a break and talk about IQ as it's measured, because IQ, I think, has a bad rep. All right, so is intelligence measurable? I would say yes, with IQ tests. And I'm going to give some examples of what IQ tests look like, because I think people haven't really looked at them or thought about them much. And even short ones are very predictive. In other words, even short IQ tests are very effective because they correlate so strongly with really, really long IQ tests in terms of the results you get. Now, another objection to IQ that comes up is, aren't IQ tests biased? And my smart aleck answer is yes, against people with low IQs. All right. But seriously, more seriously, that's not a serious answer. But a serious answer is no. I don't think they're biased because there are IQ tests that rely purely on spatial reasoning, that have no language, that have no math even in them. So there are culture-free IQ tests, and what you find is people who do well on culture-free IQ tests do well on the culturally loaded IQ test. That all of these scores tend to go together. That someone who does really well on the SAT also does well on a culture-independent or culture-free type of IQ test. And so there are all kinds of tasks on IQ tests: spatial reasoning, math, abstract problem solving, and critical thinking. I don't think those tasks in and of themselves are biased against any group, gender, culture, or anything like that. Another objection that comes up is this idea of multiple intelligences. I totally believe in multiple intelligences. I think there are many, many ways to be smart, to be intelligent, right? There are many aspects of it. But the thing is, if you name a kind of intelligence, it pretty much is almost always highly correlated with all the others. I mean, you have to come up, you have to say, well, what about athletic intelligence? And what you find is that people who have high athletic intelligence, like football players in the NFL, well, those guys tend to have high Wonderlic scores. And what's the Wonderlic? It's an IQ test that they give NFL players before they start up in the league. So it's interesting that even athletic ability, to an extent, fits the model of IQ. And actually, there's a relationship, because athletic ability, fitness, there's similarities between intelligence and fitness. All right, so here's an example of a verbal IQ test. And this isn't just a verbal IQ test. This is an extremely culturally loaded IQ test. It's actually ridiculous, right? So here's a question about Jack the Ripper in London. Here's a question about the Eiffel Tower in Paris. Here's a question about Joan of Arc. Here's a question about a form of execution during the French Revolution. It's not only is it culturally biased, it's biased to exactly the wrong culture, which is Dr. Padilla's culture, France, right? The French culture. And yet, what you find is people who do well on tests like this also do well on other kinds of verbal tests like this. And this probably looks familiar to you if you've taken the ACT, the SAT, or if you're going to graduate school, the GRE, right? Which is these analogy questions. Ruby is the sapphire, or ruby is to red as sapphire is to blue, right? I hope I got that right. This one drove me nuts. Neuter is to worker as riata. Well, I know a riata is a lasso, but neuter is the worker. It's like, well, neuter bee is a worker bee, so that's what it is. They're similes. They're the same thing. So as riato is the lariat. That's the one there. All right. Now, this is less culturally biased, don't you think, than the one I showed before? But this still has cultural elements to it, right? You have to know what a riata is, right? You have to know that very kind of narrow use of the word neuter that I think only biologists would use much, right? So there's still issues with this. So IQ researchers, have been using other things. So here's an example of a culture-free. This is like the first question you would get on one of these. Notice that there's no words anywhere. You just take your mouse and click on what you think completes the pattern. All right, so it's purely a test of spatial reasoning, but more than spatial reasoning, pattern recognition. Okay, and these are two examples of Raven's matrices. Okay, and I'm sure people have constructed arguments to say that the slide before and this one, that these types of questions somehow are culturally loaded, but I just don't see it. I don't see how there's a cultural bias in here. This isn't even math, right? This is merely your ability to recognize abstract patterns. I'm guessing that for the very easy questions, dolphins could do it. I don't know. I keep hearing how smart dolphins are. Excuse me, porpoises. Isn't dolphin really a fish, but we call porpoises dolphins? No, I don't know. So let's talk about education and IQ and the relationship between the two. I haven't answered my question. I'm just talking about how IQ is tested, and I've defended kind of IQ as an idea. All right? But doesn't education increase IQ, right? Doesn't it teach you how to think, and thus have higher indirect returns? In other words, if I'm saying that the returns to education are overstated, and you say, but education raises people's IQ, so then there are returns to higher intelligence, and therefore education's returns are actually maybe understated, Miller. And I would say that's a good point. That's a good way to think about it. That there's something to them, right? That people, while they are learning and while they're engaged in a classroom, or working on a project that you don't just learn a lot of things, but that mental exercise does a lot to make you smarter. And I think that's a good point. I think there's something to that. But here's the issue, okay? There's an effect, and it's real. All right? Education does make people more intelligent. There's actually research, lots of empirical psychological research on children that shows that, if they get a lot of practice in the classroom, all right, in normal classroom stuff, not training for the IQ test, but normal classroom stuff, and then they go and take something like Raven's matrices, they do a lot better. They do a lot better. The issue is the effect is temporary unless you keep doing it. So this is where it's not the perfect analogy, but mental exercise is a lot like physical exercise. All right? Physical exercise will make you more fit. It will make you stronger. It will make you faster. It can make you more agile. Right? You can train and become better, and you can do the same thing mentally. You can train and become better. All right? But in both cases, what happens if you sit on the couch and play video games? Well, actually, video games might improve your IQ, so I shouldn't say that. What happens if you sit on the couch and watch, it does depend on the game. What happens if you sit on the couch and watch Montel Williams? Or Maury Povich doing DNA tests, right? What happens? It decays, all right? The muscles that you built up, the endurance that you built up through exercise decays as you sit on the couch, and the mental exercise that you built up through reading, through education, through solving puzzles, okay? That also decays, all right? Because I'm pretty sure Maury Povich doesn't make you smart. No, I haven't tested it. I'm guessing, really, okay? But of all the TV shows out there, right? It's not like Teen Mom, which makes you smart. No. I love Teen Mom. Yeah. Dan D'Amico, who I think has given a talk here before, he's really big on Jersey Shore. It's his favorite show. And our argument is, which is better, Jersey Shore or Teen Mom? Sounds like a terrible argument to have. So, now, of course, there's an economist and a psychologist who got together and modeled this pattern, okay? And this is called the Dickens-Flynn model. And I'm lucky enough to know Bill Dickens, and I'm able to contact him when I want and discuss research with him. And he and I have different views on lots of things. He's a very mainstream macroeconomist, and I'm a non-mainstream microeconomist, right? But we have the intelligence research angle in common, and he's been very generous to discuss things with me. I've never met his co-author, James Flynn, who has documented this thing called the Flynn effect, because he lives in New Zealand, and I just haven't made it out there. But first of all, James Flynn observed something very interesting, which is in developed countries, the US, Canada, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, all of, pretty much all European countries, on and on, that in most developed economies, there's a pattern, which is people's IQs are actually going up. And IQ tests weren't measuring this because IQ tests are always set up so that the average is 100, and then you measure how far from the average people are, right? Below 100 is below average, above 100 is above average, and they look at statistically, how many standard deviations you are away from 100. So they always reset the mean. Well, what Flynn's did was he unreset the means. He denormalized the means. So that he was able to look at and just saying how many questions people got right. Well, people have been getting questions, doing better on IQ tests, as in getting more questions right in the US and many other advanced economies. They've been doing this for about the last 50 years. And it's very significant. We're talking about within 40 years, I think, there's been 1.5 standard deviations increase in average performance on IQ tests. That's a big deal. So people are getting smarter in developed economies. And what's also been found is that in undeveloped economies, in undeveloped countries, that there is no change. That their average IQ has stayed the same in those countries. But this is very interesting, and I think for most of us, I would hope encouraging, right? And what are the explanations? Well, the explanation is, according to Dickens-Flynn, they have a model that's a lot like the exercise analogy I used, which is in those countries, people are using computers, they're reading, right? They're looking for patterns. The menus on your phone are based on patterns and your ability to a lot of spatial reasoning and things like that. Even video games are like that, so I should give them props, right? The interesting thing that's going on is that people in advanced economies are doing more mental exercise. And so that's how Dickens and Flynn explain the increase in average IQ in those countries. It's not that people have more education, because that experiment has been tried. Well, okay, then go to less developed countries and give people more education. Well, the decay happens, right? The reason you don't see decay, the reason you see continual improvement in the US and so many other countries, is because people are continually getting mental exercise. So even as we become less fit as a nation, I want you to feel good that we are more mentally fit than we ever have been on average. And that's in spite of Maury Povich. Yes?
How does that work with the younger generations?
Like, how does it work?
Yeah, because with the younger generations, the education hasn't decreased for standardized tests.
Well, not a standardized tests are IQ tests, okay? So the way a lot of elementary level standardized tests are written and administered, they don't really fit the model of an IQ test. The SAT, of standardized tests, the SAT is really, really close to an IQ test. It correlates very highly with IQ. But the ACT less so, and the way lots of lower level standardized tests have been, is that they're really more looking for students' knowledge. There are measures of reading ability. So I have an example of how this works, of how decay works, okay? Now, I say people are getting smarter. I give you a very optimistic view, the Flynn effect and the Dickens-Flynn model that explains that people are getting more mental exercise and effort, okay? Well, one area where most people basically forget everything is algebra, all right? In most states, you take at least 2 years of algebra in high school, okay? And yet, people who have had at least one algebra course, this is their trend line and how they do on a basic algebra test. They start off with a passing grade, all right, at age, well, however long it is from the last time, this is measured distance from the last time you took an algebra course, all right? And it decays very markedly over time, so that by the time, you know, you're middle-aged, a middle-aged adult like me, or Dr. Padilla, sorry, I'm not allowed to call you middle-aged. Can I call you an adult? It was a high joke. By the time you get to age 40-ish, I mean, you're not just failing an algebra test, you're failing it miserably. You basically retain nothing from that one course you took. Now, if you've taken 2 courses, it's better, but notice that the pattern of decay is the same. You still go from a passing grade to a failing grade over your life. What are these 2 trend lines? Well, these are people who didn't just take algebra courses, but they actually took calculus courses. So this is people who have had 1 calculus course, and this is people who have had more than 1 calculus course. So people who have had multiple calculus courses basically lose no algebra knowledge throughout their lives. Now here's the thing, they were surveyed. Do you use algebra in your job? Like, you know what I mean? They were surveyed. It's like, so do you use algebra in your job? Do you use calculus in your job? No. Do you use algebra in your job? No. All right, most of these people don't use algebra in their jobs in their daily life, but they just retain it. Possibly because it was so reinforced, because, you know, to do calculus, you need to have a pretty darn good grip on algebra. Or maybe it was just repeated so many times in algebra and pre-calc, and even through calc courses it was reinforced. I don't know the mechanism, and neither do the psychologists who did this study. But it's a very interesting finding because it really does show how rapid decay can be. Even up here, we're talking about going from a very high score for a person who had 1 calculus course. They go from a very high score down to what I would call a mediocre score, like a D+ on that basic algebra test. So now our knowledge, right, our smartness, really, our ability to manipulate in algebra at least, and this has been done in reading comprehension in other areas, it really does tend to decline if you don't use it. And the reason it's so marked in algebra is because so few people use algebra in their daily lives. So that was the application of ability bias and understanding ability bias and how it relates to the private returns education, which is earning more. You know, how much of it is based on the knowledge you gain from education and how much of it is based on actually the ability you had going in. And the answer is, I would say, right, there's significant ability bias in terms of the estimates of education's private returns, in terms of earnings especially. but there are also positive externalities, okay? And most of the literature focuses on civic returns. The idea is certain behaviors and characteristics make people better citizens, and thus have positive externalities, which are called civic returns in the literature, all right? And generally, it's observed as forms of interest or engagement in politics, okay? And here's some typical measures of civicness. Almost all of them focus on interest, something like whether or not a person reads a daily newspaper, and almost all of them vote on engagement, whether or not they join political groups, whether or not they vote in elections. Voting is always measured in estimates of the civic returns of education. And what I like is that a researcher named Thomas D., and I can't remember his affiliation now because he was at Swarthmore and he changed schools, but a researcher named Thomas D., a labor economist, he also looks at tolerance, which I think, I think a lot of people would say that that's an important feature of civic behavior, right? So commitment to free speech on a variety of issues. So the standard hypothesis, and this is old, I mean this goes back to at least the early 20th century with a proponent of public education named John Dewey, is that one of the most important functions of education is not to make you earn more. It's not that that's trivial, that's important to you, but the benefit to society is that it prepares you for civic life, for life in a liberal democracy like we have. Okay, so more educated citizens are more knowledgeable, they have a greater capacity for critical thinking, and they're probably more moderate in their views as well, which is something I'm going to look at a little bit separately. And when that hypothesis is tested, education is positively correlated with all measures of civicness that you can think of. Okay? So it's pretty clear that education does have civic returns. But along comes Miller and says, well, wait a minute, that ability bias critique that we had of the private returns to education probably also applies to the external returns to education, the positive externalities. So there could be some sort of omitted variable bias, all right? Some other characteristic of more educated citizens that's helping to create those civic returns that you see in the research. The other thing is, those measures from the previous slide, this is another criticism you might have, maybe that isn't what really measures better citizens. Like, especially, like, does it really matter that you vote? Well, I mean, let's say it matters that you vote, but right, don't you care about how people vote, right? Right? Some really awful people have won popular elections, I would say, all right? And no matter who you are, you probably believe that, right? If you're happy with the current president, you probably didn't like the guy before, right? And if you liked the guy before, you probably didn't like the guy before that, all right? So it's, no matter who you are, you're probably pretty unhappy. And you probably think that what makes for true civic returns is not just that people vote, right? But that they vote intelligently, right? And that they choose candidates who are actually going to promote a better, more prosperous, freer, more tolerant society. Most people would agree. Not everybody wants to be more tolerant, not everybody wants to be more prosperous, not everybody wants to be more free. I want all of those things. All right? Those measures may not really be getting all of what's going on. And reading the newspaper, well, doesn't it matter what newspaper you read? Right? Like if you read The Onion every week, I mean, you're entertained, but I'm not sure that makes you a better citizen. All right? So do those things really make people better citizens? It's an interesting question. So I do a couple of tests. I test for omitted variable bias. I want to see if some other factor, such as cognitive ability or intelligence, in other words, significantly reduces the estimates of education's civic returns. And then I want to see if education has a similar impact on other measures of civic returns, right? I don't want to just limit it to newspaper readership and voting and stuff like that. Let's expand it, and let's just talk about whether or not people's beliefs are more moderate or more extreme. So I think how extreme people's beliefs are is an interesting thing to look at. Because if you have more moderate beliefs, it either suggests that you're not thinking, which is what some people would say, or it suggests, I think most of the time, it suggests that you're actually able to see multiple sides of an issue. Okay? So, Does education have significant returns? It does, but what I find is that there's some ability bias in there. All right? And another thing is when people talk about something like they say, oh, education has civic returns, they'll say, you know, we found that education was associated with all this kind of civic behavior. It was positively associated, and our results were statistically significant. So let me explain what that phrase statistically significant actually means. Okay? There's an economist named Deirdre McCloskey who has an interesting way of explaining statistical significance. All right, which is, suppose you had two weight loss drugs on the market. One was called Oomph and one was called Precise. In clinical trials, people who took Oomph, all right, had very varied outcomes. All right, people who took Oomph would sometimes gain 5 to 10 pounds, but the majority of them actually lost 10 pounds or more, and actually some of them lost as much as 40 pounds. All right? So Oomph is potentially a very powerful weight loss drug, but the problem is some people actually gain a little weight on it. All right? Most people lose weight on it, and some people lose a lot of weight with it. However, there's another weight loss drug on the market called Precise. And this weight loss drug called Precise is very interesting. When you take Precise, everyone in the clinical trial loses 3 pounds. Everyone, 100%. Everyone who takes Precise loses 3 pounds after they do a regimen. I don't know, 1 cycle of this drug. All right? Now here's the thing. The results of Precise in a clinical trial would be statistically significant, right? Because the results are precise, right? It's clear. It always has this effect. It's small in magnitude, but it's statistically significant. Oomph, very well, could come up as not statistically significant, even though the results are potentially big because they're uneven. Some people even gain weight, which is the key to it, right? It's hard to say that the results of Oomph were statistically significant, all right? Anything is statistically significant, though, if you just change the level, right? Statistically significant at the 80% level. So, I'm saying that because I do have check marks to know whether these things are statistically significant. I want you to understand that limitation on what statistical significance is about. All right? So, when researchers have looked at education without any control for intelligence, what they found is all these measures of civic returns, voting in the most recent election, reading a daily newspaper, group membership, you know, that means like joining the League of Women Voters or things like that. All right, it was political group membership like that. And then tolerance of free speech, allowing an anti-religionist to speak, you know, I guess basically an atheist, allowing racists to speak, homosexuals to speak, militarists, communists to speak. All right? In other words, no matter who you are in this room, there's probably something on that list you disagree with strongly, right? And yet if you're truly committed to free speech, you actually believe they all have a right to free speech. So what you find is education is very much associated with this tolerance in these areas and then these particular behaviors. When you add the intelligence control, they're all still statistically significant. All right? There's no doubt education matters. Education has civic returns. I'm not disputing that. But intelligence matters for all of them also matters and also is statistically significant for all of them except group membership. But more important, what happens to the impact of education, you know, the estimated impact of education on civic returns once you take IQ into account? And what happens is, look at this. Well, some of these are even higher than 40%, but a 30 to 40% drop-ish. Maybe I should say 25 to 45% drop in that estimated impact of education on civic returns. So the idea is intelligence matters too, all right, for all of them except group membership, which I find interesting, and that's maybe something we could discuss later in Q&A, why that would be. So another thing that interested me that I thought about, actually it wasn't my idea, it was a co-author's idea, all right? But you know, let's look at how extreme people's beliefs are. You know, what we kind of want to avoid is political extremists, not avoid, but political extremists, right and left, tend to be so committed to their cause that violence is a result, and there's antagonism, and you know, and so, you know, does education moderate people's beliefs? That was the basic question we were asking ourselves, okay? And so what did we find? we found that among those with strong beliefs, the strength of people's beliefs about economics in particular, we actually looked at social issues and environmental issues also. But on economic issues, because I'm an economist, those are the most important issues to me. But on economic issues, the distance from center is positively correlated with education and negatively correlated with intelligence. Well, let me explain that more clearly, okay? Up to about 12th grade. Well, I say this in another slide, but we use quantile regression. And what we find is among people who have really strong beliefs, having very high levels of education actually makes them more extreme in their views. But higher intelligence always moderates people's beliefs, no matter where they are in a belief distribution. Okay? And we also looked at social attitudes and views on environmental issues. Now, by the way, education does moderate people's beliefs when you stop at the high school level. So up to 12th grade, education consistently moderates people's beliefs. So it's really only for college and especially postgraduate work where high levels of education actually can intensify and make people's beliefs more extreme. We have this, but this brings a puzzle for me. This is something I've puzzled over and I've seen, and I've been asked this question a lot, so I've made a slide about it, which is what I call the professor problem, all right? Because I talk about moderate versus extreme beliefs on economic issues, and people say to me, okay, education and intelligence tend to moderate people's beliefs about economic and social issues, but that only begs the question, why do college professors then have a reputation for having very extreme economic and political views? Okay? Some of your econ professors you think have extreme economic views, one way, all right? Some of your other professors, maybe in other social sciences or humanities, you would think have very extreme economic views in another direction or very extreme political views. So let me try to, and that data that test Mike Makowski and I ran, my co-author, I think that helps us answer that question. Why is it that academics especially have a reputation for having extreme political views, extreme economic views, extreme views on social issues even? And that's because education's moderating effect basically disappears after high school. And not only does it disappear after high school, okay, but for graduate level work, it actually doesn't moderate beliefs. It tends to be associated with more extreme beliefs, as I said. The other thing is, intelligence has a clear and consistent effect on people's beliefs, but unlike with civic returns or with earnings, the effect of education, or the effect of intelligence is statistically significant, but very small. The estimated impact is pretty small. Doing 10% better, having 10% more right on a short IQ test only makes a really, really tiny difference in your average beliefs. Okay? It's consistent, it's statistically precise, but there's not a lot of power behind it. And then for those with the most, so although professors are very intelligent mostly, right? We let a few not so intelligent ones slip through the cracks now and then. All right, maybe I'm one. But for the most part, we think of them as being intelligent people. I mean, who else would wear patches on their elbows? And right, you need to be to get away with it. And we think of them as being very intelligent, but their beliefs tend to be very extreme. Well, intelligence moderates belief, but the coefficient is very, very small. So extremely intelligent people, their beliefs are more moderate than they would be otherwise, but only a little bit. It's a very small, precise effect. And for those with the most extreme views, education actually intensifies their beliefs. So here's what I would conclude, and I hope I'm leaving time for Q&A. Oh yeah, I'm doing this perfect. Is that higher education clearly has internal returns. When I say higher education, I mean college and graduate school, right? Clearly has internal returns. You earn more, right? But those returns are likely overestimated because of both signaling, I would say, and ability bias. And while K through 12 education appears to have external benefits, all right? Oh, I should have mentioned, there's another paper. Thomas Dee, the guy who did a lot of the Civic Returns research, he has looked at data more carefully, especially high school versus college. And what he found was most of the effect was from high school graduates, just like I found in terms of moderating people's beliefs, which I find interesting. But he and I were looking at two different things, two different sources of data, and came up with similar answers, which is most of the moderating effect of education is in the K through 12 range, and then after high school, you don't see much of a moderating effect of education. It basically goes away. All right, so while it appears to have external benefits, it also appears that higher education does not really have external benefits in terms of the civic returns, in terms of moderating people's beliefs. Both the internal and external returns will vary greatly depending on which subjects are being studied, right? And not just which subjects are being studied, but if you think about ability bias, who's doing the study, all right? Someone who's cut out for law school may not be cut out for medical school and vice versa, all right? So you have to tailor yourself and your own abilities to the program, and you have to think about the returns to this kind of degree are very different from the returns to another kind of a degree. All right, so what I'm going to do is open it up to questions. No?
Yeah, I had a question. You said that K through 12 tends to be the most moderating time. What is it about K through 12 education that you think is such a great moderator as opposed to...
Excellent question. Excellent question. My co-author and I have debated this and argued it, and we even tried looking at the data different ways to see if we could figure it out. I'm not going to take credit for this. My co-author is Mike Mikowski at Johns Hopkins University. He works there at the Center for Advanced Modeling in the Social, Behavioral, and Health Sciences. His thought, and it makes sense to me, his thought is that high school is just enough education, or what you learn, especially in junior high and high school, you learn just enough in those 4 or 6 years, the last 4 or 6 years before you graduate high school. You learn just enough to realize that you don't know most things. That's his idea. And the problem is, when people go to college, that doesn't change much. And then when they get graduate degrees, suddenly they think they know everything. That's our rough and ready explanation. But that's merely consistent with the data. There's no reason to believe that that explanation is true, right? Because I don't have a specific test for that explanation. I'd have to do a lot of work to see if that really makes sense. Okay? So I don't really know. I don't really know, but that's a guess.
So touching on that, my initial thought would be that it's not that education creates a radicalization of beliefs, but the self-selection that occurs.
The self-selection that occurs?
Upon entering college.
I think that's
which is
totally
why it's
awesome and consistent.
exacerbated among professors who would spend an entire career self-selected into groups that all share the same thought processes around reinforcement. And so that it's not that education creates radicalization, but that education tends that when you get to college, you have the flexibility.
The selection effect is
choose
even if that's going on maybe a little, your argument would be the selection effect is probably much stronger. I find that very intuitively plausible. All right, I find that highly, 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 I work at a university, highly plausible. Okay? Because you see even differences among disciplines where it's like, why is that your issue?
And it flex within a discipline.
Right. I mean, it's like, what does that have to, why do geologists all have that opinion on this faculty committee about tenure promotion, right? You know what I mean? Like, why is there something different about geologists? Why do they have such strong opinions on this? There could be all kinds of things, but more than that, you're right. These are small insular groups necessarily because they share a common interest, and usually most of us have specialized in a very narrow research area. So that's an interesting point. Yeah.
Staying on this question of your Professor Powell, it's not clear to me when you investigate the question of whether or not people with higher education have more extreme views. It's not clear to me that you compared PhDs, for instance, inside academia with those outside academia.
Right. Well, what we find is
In other words,
the unfortunate feature is the data is we don't. The one of the variables we don't have is what their field of work is, or even what their degree is in. It's just what level of education have you attained. All right. Right.
So it's unclear to me.
Well, you can break it down by state. We didn't see much there in terms of looking at states within the U.S. And so I hear this. Let's see, you're in a business school, because I hear this in business schools all the time. I hear this in business schools all the time. Is that people who worked in industry are not like this Miller, right? You know what I mean? But they often have advanced degrees. I'm not sure what's driving the average.
I would say maybe
Now let me qualify, all right? So this is the result that I talked about. Actually comes from a quantile regression. It's not all people who have 20 plus years of formal education have really strong opinions. It's if you look at a distribution of people's opinions, all right, how far they are, how extreme their views are. People who have really extreme views already, what it is education, very high levels of education tend to magnify. But for everyone else, right, if you were already moderate and you have 20 plus years of education, education is neutral or slightly moderating, even at those very high levels. So it's kind of what's going on over a whole distribution. So when I am looking at the most opinionated, highly educated people, I think I am capturing a lot of academics.
But I would wonder that you would find the same outside of academia too, according to your model. In other words,
If they were already, yeah, if they were already prone towards very extreme views. If they were already prone towards very extreme views on economic, social, environmental issues, the only ones I tested, so that's all I can speak to, right? If they were already prone to that, then even outside of academia, what you would see, what you would expect based on the data, is that education actually is associated with more intense belief. I want to give his explanation credit, right? Because that makes sense too. That there's a selection process.
Would formal versus informal education correlate with this as well?
Yeah. So
Like say if we
the only thing you can ever
the
measure,
course of
right? The only thing you can measure is formal education, right? Not only do I'm sure most researchers don't have a good way of measuring how much people have educated themselves, right? Now the truth is, should I tell you this? Like if you were to come to North Carolina and take my class, or you take classes here, you take classes anywhere, most of the learning that goes on is you, right?
Sure.
Right? The professor is there to explain, clarify, introduce ideas, right? Help you along, but who does the learning? You do most of the hard work. Should I say that? No, we do all the hard work. We're great. You get it from us.
we get paid, we pay you.
Right. I'm going to go over here. Didn't you have a question, sir? Okay.
So before you were kind of showing the salary breakdown and things like that.
Do you want to go back to that? Because that's interesting.
And then we also talked about, or you talked about different types of intelligence. Do you feel like there's actually like an emotional intelligence that some people just don't have, and it doesn't matter how long they go to school, they're not necessarily going to be able to social network or do what it
Yeah.
I mean, because we live in a society where
So,
a certain amount of ask is.
I think I mentioned James Heckman at the University of Chicago. He's a labor economist. He won a Nobel Prize or something. But Heckman, this is a very hot topic for him right now, and these are what he calls soft skills. And for him, it's a whole cluster of things. It's conscientiousness, like I talked about, but it's also, it's a lot of what he calls them soft skills, but then he sometimes says social skills, and he talks about socialization and whatever. There are people who have an innate level of ability with that, but he also argues very strongly that this is something that can be learned. Just like, right, just like all the book learning can be learned, just like exercise can make you more fit, right? People can develop those things. They may not, right, some of us are naturally going to be very extroverted and outgoing and very good, and some of us are not even extroverted, but some people are very good networkers, right? But the point is Heckman would argue, everybody can be made better. And so James Heckman is a big proponent of Head Start. He seems to think that Head Start is crucial to developing these soft skills. I don't really buy it. It seems to me that something with adults or people who are graduating high school would make more sense to me, but that's just, this is my view.
Do you feel like some people innately just don't have that? Like, give me
Yeah,
an
no,
example. I have a
some
family
people are better than
member,
others.
if you
Well, look,
wanna play trivia with him,
it's just like the books, right? It's just like the book smarts. It's just like athletic ability. It's just like lots of things. Some people are better than others. Their base level is better than others. And then they work hard and they get up here, and you're down here and you work hard and you get up here, right? But I'm never, ever, this is a real shame, because this was my dream as a kid. I'm never going to be the starting shortstop for the St. Louis Cardinals, right? Even though Pete Cosma is and he only hit 230 in the minor leagues.
So what you're saying is have some reality in like who you were as a person.
Yeah, exactly. Be realistic about who you are and what kind of education you're pursuing. To get a good estimate of the returns. These are averages. These are very crude averages. Get an estimate of what you're specifically looking at and think about the benefits, how they're going to be different for what you're looking at versus the average, whether they're above average or below average. And then, please, talking about people with student loan debt, think about the costs.
Don't get a little large degree and expect to be up there.
Right. But if you love that and it's your life passion and it's a consumption good for you, all right, maybe it's worth the money, right? But yeah, you're not going to be up here with a PhD in puppetry.
Right.
Maybe they only have MFAs. I think an MFA is a terminal degree in puppetry. I'm not sure. I don't think there are PhDs in puppetry. Huh? Yeah. Jim Henson Studios. That's actually an entrepreneurial opportunity for the school. You guys could have the first PhD in puppetry. Yes?
I was wondering if you could comment more on kind of what seems to be the gap between the internal and external benefits, and that our current economy is a bad example of it, but it seems like in the past 25, 30 years, the credentialing necessary to enter the job market has been bid up, even though you see the external benefits peaking at a K through 12 education.
Yeah. So let me think about one intuitive explanation of what's gone on in terms of employers requiring higher and higher degrees of job applicants. So this degree escalation in job markets. One explanation of that is that it's a collective action problem. It's like people standing up at a concert. All right. If everybody sat down at the concert, we could all see pretty well, and we would get another benefit: we'd get to sit, which maybe for you doesn't matter, but I'm at the age where sitting is better. Okay? All right? So we'd all be better off if we all sat. But what happens is you can see just a little better if you stand up. But then once you stand up, the people behind you have to stand up so they can see as well as they used to when you were sitting down. And then pretty soon everyone in the stadium is standing up. And so it's a slower process, right? But that's kind of what's going on with higher education. Because there are some jobs where it's not clear to me, that you need such a high degree to do the job. For example, in most states, you need a doctorate to be a physical therapist. It used to be you needed a master's a decade ago, and a decade before that, you needed a bachelor's degree. And a long time ago, you only needed an associate's degree. You need some training to be a physical therapist. My wife is an occupational therapist, and they're following the same pattern. It used to be you needed a bachelor's degree. Now you need a master's degree. And I'm guessing in 10 years, they'll change their credentialing system so that you need a doctorate just to be an occupational therapist, just to enter the profession. Now,
we need a vocal minority to call down from.
Yeah.
I think that's because they're trying.
I'm not sure how to make that happen.
Yeah.
I don't have the solution to collective action problems. If I did, there might be a Nobel Prize in that. Yes.
I think that's because over the last 20, 30 years, physical therapists have really relied on referrals from physicians who make the diagnoses.
Yeah.
However, with the DPTs, they're going towards physical therapists being able to diagnose.
To function more like doctors do.
Right.
Which means then they have physical therapy assistants.
Right.
The same way that you have physician's assistants, right? And nurse practitioners who are doing a lot of the actual hands-on.
Right.
The doctor sees you for 1 minute and bills you $400, right? There was a normative judgment on that positive statement, sorry. But yeah, I don't have the solution to the collective action problem. If you wanted to push me harder, though, I would say a lot of what's going on in these health fields and in other fields where there's so much credentialing, and basically you have to be licensed, and to get a license you have to have this level of education. That allows you to sit for the exam, and then you can get a license, and then you have to take continuing education credits. I think part of what's going on there is also what economists call an exclusive union model. That is, you are making it harder and harder to enter that field, which restricts the labor supply, which means higher wages for the people who are in it.
Also means better care of patients.
That's the argument on the other side. It turns out that better care for the patients also happens to coincide with higher earnings for people in those fields.
Medicare higher cost.
Well, yeah, I mean, right, the fact that there are so few doctors relative to a growing number of patients, especially geriatric patients, is going to tend to drive costs up. All right, looks like the timing was perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.